welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, PK Hattis. Well, the National Low Income Housing Coalition's Out of Reach report is hot off the press, and it has ranked Santa Cruz County as the most expensive rental market in the nation. And you know what? No one seems all that surprised. This is the third year in a row the county has taken home the top slot, and the fourth consecutive year that it is ranked among the country's top 2. According to the report, considered to be the gold standard for measuring the cost of living across the country, a renter in Santa Cruz County must earn an hourly wage of $81.21 an hour to comfortably afford a 2-bedroom unit at fair market value. California's minimum wage is $16.50, meaning a local worker earning that rate would need to work 4.9 full-time jobs to put a roof over their head. The grim milestone arrives with the county freshly embarked on an effort to construct almost 13,000 housing units cumulatively among its 5 local jurisdictions by 2032. That goal has been mandated by state housing authorities via the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA. Meanwhile, the county's population continues to rapidly age, and job growth is stagnant as it continues to lag behind neighboring jurisdictions. So, what to do? What exactly does this report mean for Santa Cruz County, and how can it be used by local policymakers and advocates to ease the housing burden that has been so unsustainably shouldered by renters for years? Well, we're very lucky to be joined today by Dan Emmanuel, Director of Research at the National Low Income Housing Coalition and a key player in crafting the Out of Reach report. Dan is calling in from Washington, D.C., and has kindly agreed to help us better understand what this report means for our Central Coast community. Dan, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, PK, and it's a real pleasure to get to come talk to you about the report this evening.
Yeah, well, the pleasure is all ours, or I don't know, actually, if we necessarily want to be in this position, but in any case, we're grateful to be speaking with you. I just want to start in broad strokes, and so I'm wondering if you can just give us a brief background about the purpose of the report and, how it all came together.
Yeah, so Out of Reach is a report that we publish every year. And as you've already cited, the primary statistic in Out of Reach is the housing wage, right? And essentially, it's intended to answer the basic question of, how much does a full-time worker need to earn per hour in order to afford a modest rental home, right? And so we take a lot of different data sources, but the primary data source we use in the analysis for the report is HUD's fair market rents. And so we look at fair market rents for basically every market in the country, all the way from, for the whole country, for states, metropolitan areas, and counties, right? And we figure out, based on that fair market rent, right, exactly how much you would have to earn per hour in order to afford an apartment renting at that rate, right? And we look at that for a number of different bedroom sizes. So we look at what you'd have to earn hourly to afford an efficiency apartment, a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom, or a 4-bedroom apartment. And we do that for the whole country, right? And so, as you've also alluded to, part of what we do in the report is we rank places relative to one another. And obviously, probably one of the reasons I'm here talking to you tonight is that for maybe the second or third consecutive year, we ranked Santa Cruz as having the highest housing wage in the country. Mm-hmm. And I'd say, one thing about that I want to point out right here at the top is that, I don't personally think about the rankings we do as like an indicator of local success or failure. Like, I really just think about them as indicators of the severity of housing needs across the country, right? And so when I see that, like, Santa Cruz is ranked at the top, I know there are actually a lot of different factors that are going into that. And, locally, you guys only have control maybe over some of those factors. So, for example, I would say, it's not really anybody's fault in Santa Cruz that Santa Cruz is like a really nice place to live and that there are a lot of people want to live there, right? So there's just naturally a lot of demand that might not exist in other places that we're ranking. right? Mm-hmm. And I'd also say, it's like also not the fault of voters or like a local elected officials in Santa Cruz that there's not, an adequate federal housing safety net and that our subsidy programs are like completely oversubscribed, right? So I really don't want to give the impression that the rankings are about who's doing a better or worse job at the local level. They're intended to speak more to identifying places that are dealing with severe challenges and maybe need the most assistance, from the federal government. That being said, though, like I'd say, having the highest housing wage is definitely, pretty concerning. And I do think there are things that can be done, locally, things that you all have control over that can help maybe improve housing affordability a bit. And of course, there are also some federal policies that are really salient to addressing some of these affordability challenges, and particularly for, the lowest income renters.
Yeah, and I am eager to get into all of that. Before we do, though, there's one more question, just kind of, setting our levels here that I wanted to ask you to answer for me, and that is regarding just the report's sort of flagship statistic, which is the housing wage, which we've mentioned several times. Can you just unpack for us how that housing wage is calculated and why it's such an important statistic to pay attention to?
So the housing wage, it's a little convoluted probably to explain on the radio, but the housing wage is essentially what we do to calculate the housing wage is we take a fair market rent for a given area, right? And then we figure out how much that amounts to annually in terms of rent. And then we figure out how much someone would have to earn annually in order to afford that rent without spending more than 30% of their income, right? And then we take that annual income that you would need and we turn it into a wage, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, right. No,
That's
I just think
it's the basic procedure for calculating the housing wage. It's really a very direct reflection of HUD's fair market rent, which I should specify here. It's the fair market rent is basically HUD's estimate of what a typical family that's moved recently in any given area is going to pay for rent, for a typical unit, right? Mm-hmm. Technically speaking, the more technocratic answer to what fair market rent is that it is HUD's estimate using the American Community Survey of a 40th percentile rent for a recent mover in any given fair market rent area. Mm-hmm. So, and that's typically a county or a metro area.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, yeah, I appreciate you kind of expanding on that. I know it is a little bit in the weeds, but it's I think interesting
Happy
for our listeners. Yeah, no, I know you're a data guy, so I figured you're the right person to ask the question to. Let's get into sort of local Santa Cruz County stuff. Even though this report is like almost 600 pages long, you have a lot of jurisdictions to pay attention to. I certainly, though, appreciate any insights you gleaned from the report about Santa Cruz County specifically, because after all, we did rank number one, which, as you say, it's not meant as sort of an indictment of any policy or voters or anything like that, but it is meant to inform about, what the conditions are like on the ground. So I want to ask you, when you look at the statistics with Santa Cruz County, what jumps out to you? This is the third year in a row we've ranked number one. Is there any trends or statistics that you think are worth highlighting?
Well, I think, it's the ranking that I think that jumps out to most, to be totally frank with you. I mean, $81.21 an hour for a 2-bedroom housing wage is pretty intense, right? So maybe another way to think about this, though, is to think about, monthly income and then monthly rental costs. So, a good example, it's kind of like phrase this a little bit differently, right? So if you looked at, for example, what HUD would call an extremely low income household, right? An extremely low income family of 4 in Santa Cruz, right? That household, that's kind of like the lowest income group identified by HUD. So that's a household that's earning about 30% of the area median or the federal poverty guideline, whichever happens to be higher in a given jurisdiction, right? In Santa Cruz, that family earns about $4,945 a month, right? This is that family that's, ideally that we're targeting with the subsidy, right? So they earn about $4,945 a month, right? And the 2-bedroom fair market rent, right, is a family of 4, so we're looking at a 2-bedroom unit, right? The 2-bedroom fair market rent in Santa Cruz is $4,223, right? So they would effectively have to pay about 85% of their income in rent if they didn't have a subsidy to afford rent there, right? Mm-hmm. And that would leave them so they would be what we technically call in housing policy severely cost burdened. They're paying well north of half of their income in rent, right? And if they were to pay out of pocket, right, for no subsidy for that fair market rent, right, they'd have about $722 left over any month to cover all of the rest of their family's expenses. So transportation, food, medical care, any kind of emergencies that arise, right? So, the point of illustrating this, I guess, is to say, the lowest income renters have particularly acute needs, and they are particularly in a precarious situation here, right? Because they have so little residual income left over after they're paying for rent, right? So, one car repair that comes up, they have to fix the car because it's broken down and they can't get to work, and they need to get to work in order to get paid to pay their rent, right? Mm-hmm. If they just have one car expense crop up, that can throw off their entire budget and then put them behind on rent, right? And they end up in this vicious cycle where they're behind on rent and maybe they eventually get evicted, right? So, I'd say, there's a lot of conversation in these, and certainly in Santa Cruz, you're seeing housing costs creep well north of this income group, right? This is also a problem for middle income renters. But I would say, ultimately, the people that really struggle the most, even in places where you're getting, housing costs creeping up and impacting middle income households, the people that are still struggling the most are the lowest income renters. Mm-hmm. As I've just kind of shown you in that example there, right? And I think the other thing to remember about that is that, the federal government isn't there providing a real safety net to support that.
Right.
So, unlike food stamps, which are an entitlement, right? Housing assistance is only provided actually for 1 in 4 households that actually qualify for it. Right, so
across
we effectively
the country?
have lotteries across the country. Mm. We effectively have a lottery system for receiving housing assistance, right? So, at one point we committed to not letting people starve to death, right? So we came up with an entitlement to help ensure people's food security. We just haven't done that yet for people's security with their shelter, right? So. Things are pretty dire, and especially for this lowest income group. And I don't want that to be lost in the weeds here.
No, I appreciate you really highlighting that and driving that point home. And of course, covering a lot of these issues with a hyper-local lens. We know how recent federal budget policies, the federal budget, the spending resolution that just went through cuts back majorly on SNAP and Medicaid, or Medi-Cal as it's known here in Santa Cruz County. And we know, I appreciate your point even more because we know how housing is kind of the nexus where many of these issues converge, and they sort of push and pull on one another. And so it can create cascading effects when you have dire issues with housing, and it can lead to healthcare and food costs and transportation issues, another hot topic in Santa Cruz County. So it's good to draw those connections, and I appreciate you doing so. If you're just joining us, let me just reintroduce my guest today. I am speaking with Dan Emmanuel, Director of Research at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We're here to talk about the coalition's recently released Out of Reach report, which ranked Santa Cruz County for the 3rd time in a row as the most unaffordable rental market in the nation. Again, this is KSQD's Talk of the Bay on 89.5, 89.7, 90.7 FM. I just wanted to follow up to on another point that you made, just talking about Santa Cruz County's housing wage being the top And I think it's worth mentioning that the runner-up this year was Santa Clara County. But Santa Cruz's housing wage was almost $15 higher per hour than Santa Clara County's, which took home the second spot. And their wage was $66.27 an hour. Another key statistic I think to mention is that 38,771, according to this report, 38,771, there were that many rental households in Santa Cruz County between 2019 and 2023, and that represents 40% of households overall here in Santa Cruz County. So this is an issue that affects almost half the population, and I think we all everyone that lives here intuitively kind of knows that, but it's good to have the stats to back it. Dan, I want to ask about sort of moving towards solutions as best we can. Again, this is a national report. You only have so much time to dig into local issues, but I do want to ask from your perspective, like what could help Santa Cruz County drop a few notches in this report? Because this is the third year in a row. And like I said, I don't think anyone was really surprised. And yet there was sort of an exasperation that I sensed talking to different housing folks across the county, and just sort of feeling like, how can we drop? We've been aware of this issue for so long, and we see all sorts of housing kind of popping up across the county, and yet there we are at the top. So I'm just wondering if there's any specific, policies you think could help here in Santa Cruz County, or other policies you've seen implemented across the country that you think are particularly effective for lowering that housing wage that's so crucial.
Yeah, sure. And I just want to say I really appreciate that you're asking about solutions. And I think that's really important to do, especially in the context of, being in the place that ranks the worst in affordability, right? I feel like that can start to seem like this kind of intractable problem, but it definitely isn't. Mm-hmm. So, I haven't looked specifically how local policies impact housing wage rankings, but I can definitely give you kind of like an idea of some of the policies that you all have control of locally that might be worth implementing if you haven't already done so. So there are really kind of like two different buckets here. There's kind of like policies that address, increasing the overall supply of housing, right? Mm-hmm. And including market rate housing, and to better address that kind of general affordability problem, and certainly the affordability problem higher up the income ladder. And then there's kind of like another bucket of policies that all deal with like subsidy, right? That are about increasing the subsidized housing stock and helping eligible people afford rent. So they're kind of policies to improve the market rate supply and let the market do what it's supposed to be able to do and actually function well, right? And then there are the subsidy policies to address housing needs that the market will not address, period, on its own, right? And those are kind of like systemic issues that everybody across the whole country deals with, right? So I would say, since, we're talking about coastal California, I imagine there's probably some tension around building new housing. That seems to be a hot topic. And all of those places we rank near the top in California, I think like 6 or 7 in the top 10 counties in the country in California are in, 6 of the worst ranked country, or 7 of the worst ranked counties in the country are all in California, all pretty close to you, right? So, I do think one of the things all those places have in common is a real struggle to be able to build new housing and build new housing densely, right? Build a lot of it in a smaller space, right? Make the most out of the land that you have and that you can develop. So, really, I think it's absolutely essential that we're, finding ways to make it easier to build, and that those things impact both market rate and affordable housing, I want to point out, and it's important that you're trying to build with greater density, right? And you're allowing that to happen. You're allowing the market to do that. And there are definitely some, examples of policies on that front that can help facilitate that. And so a couple of those might include, allowing the building to accessory dwelling units or things like granny flats, eliminating parking requirements, reducing minimum lot sizes, reducing or eliminating single-family zoning. A lot of the country, it's not even legal to build multifamily housing, right? It's zoned only for single families, right? In a lot of the country. I think it's also good to think about, streamlining the permitting process for housing. Sometimes it just takes too darn long to get housing online because it's a really, treacherous process for a developer of any sort, especially really even affordable housing developers, to navigate the whole process, from start to finish of getting all the approvals that they need in order to actually build something, right? It takes too long. And that ultimately makes it cost more to build housing. So I think there's like a whole menu of, kind of things that we can do to help the market build, actually produce more housing and function better. But then, of course, there's also this question of subsidy, which is every bit as important, right? And the two really, they're hand in glove. They go together, in my view. And there are definitely local policies that you can think about in Santa Cruz and your general area. And I don't know if you've implemented some of these or not yet, but very common kind of local policies are local housing trust funds, revolving loan funds that provide low interest or no interest loans for affordable housing development. And that's all, those type of loans are often very helpful for low-income housing tax credit developers, because the tax credit, which is our primary subsidy, right, that we have for affordable housing construction in this country, is actually designed to require what we call gap financing. So it's not a complete subsidy on its own, and you need additional local subsidies to actually pencil out the math on a tax credit development. So, local housing trust funds and revolving loan funds can really do important work in helping actually make the most of the federal subsidies that are out there and serve more people. And then, of course, solutions like community land trusts are really important, right? In many communities, they're used to kind of ensure that the land itself is restricted to affordable housing development in the long term, right? And then, of course, I think, if communities have the resources, and I'm sure, I bet Santa Cruz is probably a better off community than a lot of the communities we look at, right? I think they should really be thinking about implementing all of these policies. I think there's a need for a whole constellation of solutions. There are really no silver bullets. And then, of course, I think I'd be remiss not to say also that, at the end of the day, when it comes to the subsidy side of this, and I've already alluded to this earlier, right? Most of the money really does usually still come from the feds, right? And it's really the federal government that has the wherewithal to implement something like a housing assistance entitlement or expand housing vouchers so that everybody eligible gets one, right? And then, of course, unfortunately, that is decidedly not what's happening in Congress right now. You can talk a little bit more about that if you want.
Yeah, I think we've alluded to it earlier in the show, and I don't think you're surprising me or any of our listeners that, some of that national vouchers or subsidies don't seem to be likely, at least in the next few years. But I really appreciate you there's so much to unpack in what you just said and a lot of interesting proposals. And I will say, policy-wise, some of what you mentioned, I think a lot of what you mentioned and laid out, at least from my perspective, covering it at the county level is those are terms and words that are thrown around a lot. So I think it's something that local policymakers are at least aware of. And one thing specifically, just kind of drawing it back to the local rankings of the report, one specific question I wanted to ask you, just as a data wonk, is one of the questions that came up for me is there like a data lag that we should be aware of? Because driving in downtown Santa Cruz, if you drive around town, it does feel like there are quite a few housing projects that are in development. There's quite a few that have opened up even in recent months and years. And yet it feels like we're just still stuck there. So I wonder if there's like a data lag that has anything to do with this, and maybe in a year or two we'll start to see significant drops or improvements. But I wonder if that's a factor or if perhaps I'm oversimplifying.
No, I don't think that's a great question. And you're not oversimplifying at all. And it is so with the fair market rents, there is a bit of a data lag in the source that's used to estimate the rents, right? Because the HUD uses what's called the American Community Survey, and the most recent iteration of that survey was collected in 2023. And then HUD also, and recently, starting actually in 2023, HUD started using private rental listing data to try to get a more accurate assessment and more recent data, frankly, and factor that into these fair market rent estimates, right? And then ultimately what they do is they come up with an estimate and they project it forward to the next year, right? They try to estimate what inflation is going to be, and they inflate the rent in anticipation of that to try to estimate what it will be in the coming year, right? So that then the other thing to know about the fair market rents is they're actually what's used to set the payment standards for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So it's like an administrative data set, right? But yes, you're right to point out that there is a bit of a lag there. The other thing I'll say is that, when it comes to these market rate kind of solutions, right, the impact of these policies of trying to increase market rate production can take a while to work through the system, right? Partly because when you're expanding supply, you might see rents going down at the top of the market, right? Because that's where the new supply is being targeted generally. And you can still have rent inflation at the bottom of the market, right? And it takes some time for, the units to age over time. Essentially, units filter down. As more units are produced, higher income households are moving into newer units. Older units are becoming cheaper, right? And it can take years for that process to work its way through the system. And certainly, for the lowest income households, it might be, 10, 20, 30 years before they see any kind of benefit from what was produced many years ago, right? As that housing filters down over time. And in some cases, they may never even benefit from it because the housing either, in a tight market will get rehabbed and then rented out to a higher income household, and kind of a weaker market, there's kind of a danger of that housing over time just falling out the bottom of the market. And that's actually what kind of drives the systemic shortage for the lowest income renters around the whole country. But yeah, so there is a data lag, and it can just take time to see the impacts on the affordability. It can take several years before you start to see that. But in the studies that have been done on this, there was a study by the Urban Institute that looked at the impact of some of these deregulatory and zoning reforms, right? And they found that it did have it led to an appreciable and statistically significant increase in the supply of housing that's affordable to households, moderate income households, and the middle income households as well. So it will have an effect.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we'll have to be a little bit patient to see that effect really come to fruition in areas we can really see it and measure it. And in that case, we will be eagerly awaiting the coalition's report next year, and hopefully we'll have dropped a notch or two. I think we'll have to leave it there. Dan, you've been listening to KSQD's Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, PK Hattis. We've been speaking with Dan Emmanuel, Director of Research at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We've been talking about the coalition's Out of Reach report, which ranked Santa Cruz County for the third time in a row as the most expensive and unaffordable rental market in the nation. Dan, thank you so much for helping break down this issue for us. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on your show.